Welcome back to Drowsy History. Find a comfortable position. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the weight of the day begin to soften and settle, like dust that has been floating in a beam of light and is slowly, gently, drifting to the floor. Tonight we are going somewhere ancient, somewhere made of stone and sunlight, of river water and wood smoke, of olive oil and warm bread, and the distant sound of a city that has been humming for more than 1,000 years. Close your eyes and imagine for a moment that you are standing in the early morning stillness, and beneath your feet the stones are smooth and worn by centuries of footsteps. You are standing on a road, a very old road, and on either side of you, the buildings of a great city rise into a sky that is just beginning to shift from deep violet into the soft gold of a Roman dawn. To your left, the Tiber River moves with a slow and steady certainty, its surface catching the first pale light of morning. The air smells faintly of water and baked earth, of stone that has been warmed by countless summers and cooled by countless winters. Somewhere nearby, a cartwheel turns over cobblestone, and a vendor is already calling out in the musical lilt of Latin, announcing the freshness of his morning bread. You are in Rome. Not Rome as it is today, with its traffic and tourists and electric lights, but Rome as it was at the very height of its ancient power, a city of perhaps 1 million people, the largest in the Western world, the center of an empire that stretched from the misty shores of Britain to the scorched deserts of Mesopotamia, from the cold forests of the Rhine to the ancient sands of Egypt. And tonight we are going to trace the entire story of how that empire came to be. We will begin in a time before cities, when central Italy was covered in oak forest and the banks of the Tiber were home to scattered farming villages of thatched huts and painted pottery. We will watch a small settlement grow slowly into a kingdom, and then a republic, and then an empire that would shape the course of human civilization for the next 2,000 years. We will walk with Romulus on the hills above the river. We will hear the Senate debates in the marble colonnades of the Forum. We will cross the Alps alongside Hannibal's elephants, trudging through snow that no army had ever dared navigate before. We will stand beside Julius Caesar as he poses on a cold January night at the bank of a small river in northern Italy, the fate of the world balanced on the edge of a single decision. We will fall gently into the warm routine of a Roman afternoon. The baths, the markets, the smell of frying garlic, and the sound of children playing in the courtyard. We will march with the legions on frontier roads at the very edge of the known world, and we will watch, slowly and quietly, as the great empire fades into the long twilight of history, leaving behind a legacy that never truly ended. This is the story of Rome. It is your story tonight. Breathe in, breathe out, and let it begin. Part 1. The legendary founding of Rome. To understand Rome, you have to understand the land that produced it. The Italian peninsula juts southward into the Mediterranean Sea like a long, elegant boot. In the centuries before Rome existed, it was a mosaic of forest and farmland, mountain and plain. The spine of the peninsula was formed by the Apennine Mountains, a range of rugged hills that ran nearly the full length of the boot, dividing the warm western coast from the cooler Adriatic shore to the east. Between the mountains and the sea, in a region the Romans would call Latium, a broad plain was watered by several rivers, the most important of which was the Tiber. The Tiber was not a dramatic river. It was not wide and majestic like the Nile, or swift and silver bright like an alpine stream. It was amber-colored, even muddy, fed by clay-rich soils, and it moved with a kind of patient, unhurried deliberation as it curved southward through the hills of Latium toward the sea. But it was exactly this quality that made it useful. The Tiber was navigable. It was a highway, long before anyone built a road, and anyone who controlled the easiest crossing point of that river controlled the movement of trade and people across the whole of central Italy. In the centuries around 900 to 800 BCE, long before Rome had a name, the lower Tiber Valley was home to a people called the Latins. The Latins were one of many Italic peoples who inhabited the peninsula, related by language and culture, but divided into dozens of small communities, each clustered around a hilltop or a river bend, each tending their fields of emmer wheat and their flocks of sheep and goats. Life in these villages was simple and physically rooted. The Latins grew grain, kept pigs, fired pottery, and buried their dead with small offerings of food and bronze. They built their houses from timber and thatch, and the smoke of their cooking fires drifted up into skies that were full of stars. On clear nights, the hills that would one day become Rome sat at a particularly important spot along the Tiber, a point where an island in the river made crossing easier, and where a cluster of hills rose high enough above the plain to provide natural defense. 7 of these hills would later become famous: the Palatine, the Aventine, the Capitoline, the Quirinal, the Viminal, the Esquiline, and the Caelian. But in those early centuries, they were simply high ground, good places to keep watch, good places to keep flocks safe from wolves and flooding. It was here on these hills that the Romans later said their city was founded, and it was here that one of the most enduring origin stories in all of human history was set. The legend of Romulus and Remus begins, as great stories often do, with treachery and exile. In the city of Alba Longa, a few miles to the southeast of the Tiber Hills, a king named Numitor had been overthrown by his own younger brother, Amulius. To prevent any threat to his power, Amulius forced Numitor's daughter, a young woman named Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal virgin, bound by sacred oath to a life of celibacy. No children, no heirs, no challenge to the usurper's throne. But Rhea Silvia, the story tells us, was visited by the god Mars, the god of war and spring and agriculture, one of the most ancient and powerful of the Roman gods, and from that divine encounter she conceived twin sons. When Amulius discovered the twins' birth, he was furious. He ordered them killed, but the servant tasked with this terrible duty could not bring himself to do it. Instead, he placed the infants in a basket and set them gently upon the current of the Tiber, trusting the river to decide their fate. The river, as rivers sometimes do in stories, was kind. The basket drifted downstream and came to rest at the foot of the Palatine Hill, where a fig tree, a sacred tree in Roman tradition called the Ficus ruminalis, spread its branches over the bank. There a she-wolf found the boys, and she nursed them, fed them with her milk, kept them warm with her body heat in the cool shade of the fig tree, until a shepherd named Faustulus discovered them and brought them home to his wife. The image of the she-wolf suckling the twins became perhaps the most iconic image in all of Roman history. It appeared on coins and paintings, on bronze sculptures and marble reliefs for 1,000 years and more. That image, fierce and maternal at once, wild but nurturing, said something essential about how Romans understood their own origins. They came from something raw and untamed, something not quite civilized, something that had been nursed by the land itself before it learned to build walls. Romulus and Remus grew up among shepherds, strong and bold and quick to fight. When they eventually learned of their royal heritage, they returned to Alba Longa, overthrew Amulius, restored their grandfather Numitor to his throne, and then set out to found a city of their own. They chose the Tiber Hills, the place where they had been rescued by the river and raised by the wolf, but they could not agree on which hill should be the site of the new city. Romulus favored the Palatine, Remus preferred the Aventine. They decided to resolve the dispute through augury, the ancient Roman practice of reading divine will through the behavior of birds. They waited and watched. Remus saw 6 vultures rise from the south. Romulus moments later saw 12. By the count of birds, Romulus had the greater sign. He took a plow and traced the sacred boundary, the pomerium, of his new city into the earth around the Palatine Hill, turning the first furrow that would define Rome. The date, according to Roman tradition, was the 21st of April, in the year 753 BCE, a date so precisely remembered that Romans calculated their entire calendar of history from it, marking the years AUC, Anno Urbis Conditae, in the year of the founded city. But then Remus did something fatal. Whether out of mockery or impatience or wounded pride, he leapt over the low walls his brother had just built. In crossing those sacred boundaries that were not merely practical but ritually religiously significant, he violated something that could not be forgiven. In a burst of fury, Romulus killed his twin brother. Thus perish all who cross my walls, Romulus is said to have declared. The city was founded in blood and fraternal violence. That too said something about Rome. Now, pause here and breathe for a moment. The story is beautiful, but it is also just that, a story. The historians and the archaeologists have spent centuries asking how much of it is true, and the honest answer is that we cannot be certain of any of the specific details. The legend of Romulus and Remus was probably not written down in its familiar form until several centuries after the events it claims to describe. It borrows motifs found in older cultures. The abandoned hero raised by animals is a pattern as ancient as storytelling itself. And yet, archaeology has found something real beneath the myth. Excavations on the Palatine Hill have uncovered evidence of human settlement dating to the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, the very period Roman tradition assigns to the founding. Italian archaeologist Andrea Carandini, working on the Palatine in the late 20th century, discovered what he believed to be traces of an ancient wall and a large structure that could have been a chieftain's palace, dated by foundation deposits to around 775 to 750 BCE. He announced controversially that he had found archaeological evidence of the existence of Romulus. Most of his colleagues were skeptical, but the find was real. There was a significant early settlement on the Palatine at exactly the time the legend speaks of. Perhaps what really happened on that April morning in 753 BCE was neither myth nor pure invention. Perhaps there was a real moment, a ceremony, a festival, a ritual plowing of a boundary line, when several separate hilltop communities were formally united under a single name, a single identity, a single story about where they had come from and what they were destined to become. That is, perhaps, enough. A people need an origin. Rome's origin was the wolf, the river and the twins. Part 2. The Roman Kingdom. After Romulus came the kings, 7 of them, according to Roman tradition, a number that feels both too neat and too few to account for the roughly 2.5 centuries, during which Rome was said to have been ruled by monarchy. But the Romans themselves held on to those 7 names with conviction, even as they admitted that reliable details about the earliest reigns were scarce. These kings were Romulus, Numa Pompilius, Tullus Hostilius, Ancus Marcius, Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus, names that carried specific associations, specific personalities, specific contributions to the growing city. Let us walk through them, gently, the way you might walk through the rooms of a very old house, touching the objects on the shelves and imagining the hands that placed them there. Romulus himself, the first king, the founder, was above all a warrior. His reign was characterized by the expansion of Rome's population and territory, mostly through conflict with neighboring communities. The famous episode of the rape of the Sabine women, a story as uncomfortable as its name suggests, describes how Romulus solved an early shortage of women in his new city by inviting the neighboring Sabine people to a festival and then, at a signal, having his men seize the Sabine women as wives. The Sabine men were outraged and went to war with Rome, but the abducted women, now wives and mothers, eventually threw themselves between the fighting armies and begged for peace. The Sabines and Romans merged. It was a violent founding of something that would later be called inclusivity. When Romulus died, or rather, when he vanished in a sudden storm during a military review, he was deified, transformed in memory into the god Quirinus, the protector of the Roman people. The very first emperor of Rome, he became the first of Rome's long tradition of turning its leaders into legends. His successor, Numa Pompilius, was everything Romulus was not. Numa was quiet, pious, reflective. Where Romulus had built through war, Numa built through ritual. He was credited with establishing most of Rome's religious institutions, the calendar, the system of priestly colleges, the temple of Janus, whose doors stood open in wartime and closed, allegedly only twice in centuries, during periods of peace, and the figure of the Pontifex Maximus, the great bridge builder, the chief priest who maintained the relationship between the city and its gods. During Numa's reign, tradition says, Rome was entirely at peace, the Janus doors were closed. Picture the city in those early years. It was still small, perhaps a few thousand people, clustered on and around the Palatine Hill with the marshy valley below, the future forum still too wet and prone to flooding for permanent settlement. Houses were timber framed, with walls of wattle and daub, thatched roofs, beaten earth floors. The smell of the city in those years would have been the smell of wood smoke and animal dung, of damp wool and roasting grain, of the river mud that clung to everything near the Tiber's banks. The streets, such as they were, would have been unpaved paths connecting houses and storerooms and animal pens, worn smooth by the feet of people and the hooves of cattle. Children played among the chickens and dogs. Women ground grain and wove cloth. Men tended crops on the slopes of the hills and herded animals on the marshy plain. At night, oil lamps cast a warm amber glow from the doorways of houses, and the dark between settlements was genuinely dark. No artificial light, just the moon and the stars and the occasional torch. But the city was growing. Under the third king, Tullus Hostilius, Rome fought and destroyed its older neighbor Alba Longa, absorbing its population and doubling its numbers overnight. Under the fourth king, Ancus Marcius, the first bridge was built across the Tiber. A tremendous achievement, a declaration that the city intended to connect itself permanently to both banks of the river. Ancus also founded Ostia, a settlement at the river's mouth where it emptied into the Tyrrhenian Sea, establishing the first foothold in what would eventually become Rome's window to the Mediterranean world. With the fifth king, Tarquinius Priscus, the character of Rome began to change. Tarquinius Priscus was, according to tradition, of Etruscan origin. His father was a Greek merchant who had settled in the great Etruscan city of Tarquinia. This matters because the Etruscans were the most sophisticated civilization in central Italy at that time. They built cities with stone temples and underground drains. They wore elaborate jewelry of hammered gold. They held magnificent feasts on carved ivory couches. They had a written language. They painted their tombs with scenes of dancing and feasting, and the pleasures of life. Tarquinius brought this culture to Rome. Under his reign, the Romans began draining the swampy valley between the hills, a massive engineering project involving the construction of the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer, still one of the most impressive surviving pieces of ancient Roman engineering, channeling water away from what would become the Roman Forum. He began the construction of the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, a project so vast it would not be completed until the reign of his successor. He also built the Circus Maximus, the great racing track that would eventually hold more than 250,000 spectators. Under Tarquinius, Rome began to look like a city. The sixth king, Servius Tullius, gave Rome its first wall and its first constitution. The Servian Wall, rebuilt in later centuries but originally attributed to Servius, enclosed all 7 hills within a single defensive perimeter, a statement to the world that Rome was no longer a collection of villages but a unified city. The constitution he introduced organized the Roman citizenry into classes based on wealth and military capability, creating the framework of the centuriate assembly that would remain fundamental to Roman political and military life for centuries. Under Servius, Romans began to see themselves not merely as members of a family or a clan or a neighborhood, but as citizens of something larger. Rome had an identity now. It had walls. The seventh and final king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, ruled as a tyrant. He was arrogant and cruel, dismissive of the Senate, contemptuous of the traditions his predecessors had built. He completed the Temple of Jupiter, it is true, and he conducted successful wars, but he governed through fear rather than consent, and eventually the patience of the Roman nobility ran out. The breaking point came through a personal outrage. Tarquin's son Sextus raped a virtuous Roman noblewoman named Lucretia, the wife of a prominent Roman. Lucretia reported what had happened to her father and husband, and then she took her own life rather than live with the shame. Her kinsman Lucius Junius Brutus, an aristocrat who had spent years feigning stupidity to survive at Tarquin's the dangerous court, held up her body before the Roman people and called for revolution. In 509 BCE, Tarquin the Proud was driven from Rome. The monarchy was finished, and something entirely new was about to begin. Part 3: Birth of the Roman Republic. The Republic was born in anger and built on principle. When the last king of Rome fled into exile, the Romans who drove him out faced a profound question. What should they put in his place? They had seen what kings could become when unchecked. They had felt the weight of a single man's arbitrary will, and so they invented, or perhaps more accurately, they formalized and institutionalized a system of government designed to prevent any one person from ever holding too much power again. The answer was balance. Shared power, mutual restraint. Two men, elected annually, would replace the single king. They were called consuls, and each had the absolute right to veto the decisions of the other. No single consul could act unilaterally on matters of state without his colleagues' agreement. If they disagreed, nothing happened. That was sometimes frustrating, but it was also the point. Deadlock was safer than tyranny. Behind the consuls stood the Senate. The Senate was technically an advisory body, a council of elders drawn from Rome's patrician families, the old aristocracy whose ancestors had been present at the city's founding. Senators served for life, their membership growing through co-optation and the admission of former magistrates. The Senate did not formally vote on legislation in the way a modern parliament does, but its collective opinion, expressed as advice, the Senatus Consultum, the Senate's resolution, carried enormous weight. Consuls who ignored the Senate did so at their peril. The Senate controlled the treasury, allocated the provinces, decided on war and peace, and received foreign ambassadors. It was the embodiment of collective Roman wisdom, at least in theory. The system was also deeply unequal. Roman society in the early republic was divided into two orders, patricians and plebeians. The patricians were the ancient aristocratic families. Small in number but enormous in power and privilege, they monopolized the magistracies, the priesthoods, and the right to interpret the sacred laws. The plebeians, the vast majority of the Roman population, were farmers and craftsmen, merchants and soldiers, people without noble birth, barred by custom and tradition from the most important positions in the state. This division produced a long, slow, grinding conflict that would occupy the Roman Republic for more than 2 centuries. It is called, quietly, the struggle of the orders. The plebeians wanted a share of power, and they got it. Not all at once, not through revolution, but through a series of hard-won incremental gains. One of their most powerful weapons was the right of secession. 3 times in the early republic, the plebeians of Rome simply left. They walked out of the city, gathered on the Sacred Mount or the Aventine Hill just outside the walls, and refused to work, to fight, or to pay taxes until they were granted concessions. These strikes, for that is essentially what they were devastatingly effective, because Rome could not function without its plebeian farmers and soldiers. From these confrontations emerged the tribunes of the plebs, magistrates elected exclusively by the plebeians, who possessed the sacred and inviolable right of intercessio, the right to physically intervene and say no to any action by a patrician magistrate that threatened plebeian interests. The tribune's person was sacrosanct. To harm a tribune was to invite divine punishment. Gradually, over the following decades and centuries, the plebeians won the right to hold the consulship, the right to sit in the Senate, the right to have Rome's laws written down and made publicly accessible. The famous 12 tables, inscribed on bronze plaques and posted in the Forum around 450 BCE, so that the law could no longer be secretly manipulated by patrician priests. By the middle of the 4th century BCE, the struggle of the orders was essentially resolved. Rome had developed something that was not yet democracy, but was not quite aristocracy either. It was a mixed constitution, a system in which no single element of society had absolute control, in which power was distributed across multiple institutions, checks and balances were built into the architecture of governance, and the rights of all free citizens, at least in principle, were protected by law. The political philosopher Polybius, writing centuries later, would identify this mixed constitution as the secret of Rome's extraordinary resilience and success. He saw in the Roman Republic a balance between the monarchical element, the consuls, the aristocratic element, the Senate, and the democratic element, the popular assemblies and the tribunes. And he argued that this balance, unlike pure monarchy or pure democracy, both of which tended toward corruption and collapse, could sustain itself indefinitely. He was not entirely wrong. Picture the Roman Forum on a morning in the early Republic. The valley between the hills has been drained and paved with flat stones, and around its edges the temples and basilicas are rising slowly, their tufa stone blocks pale and freshly cut. The Temple of Saturn, the oldest surviving Roman temple, stands at the edge of the forum, its columns of warm-colored stone reflecting the morning light. The rostra, the speaker's platform, decorated with the bronze rams of captured enemy ships, faces the open space of the forum itself, where citizens gather to hear announcements, witness ceremonies, and argue about the affairs of the city. A crier reads out the latest decisions of the Senate. Merchants cluster near the edges of the forum, doing business from temporary stalls. An augur stands apart from the crowd, watching the sky with a quiet, patient attention, reading the will of the gods in the movement of birds. Somewhere, a lawyer is preparing arguments for a case that will be heard before a magistrate's tribunal. The forum is, all at once, marketplace and sacred precinct, political square, and law court, the beating heart of Roman public life. And beyond the forum, beyond the hills and the walls, the world waited. The world had no idea what was coming. Part 4: Rome conquers Italy. The early republic was not peaceful. It could not afford to be. Rome sat in the middle of a peninsula, crowded with peoples who were sometimes neighbors, sometimes trading partners, and sometimes enemies. To the north, the wealthy and sophisticated Etruscans had long been the dominant power in central Italy, their cities dotting the hills north of the Tiber with bronze-gated temples and painted underground tombs. To the south, the Greek colonies of Magna Graecia, Great Greece, sparkled along the coastlines, their agoras and harbors full of philosophers and merchants and fishermen. In the mountains of the Apennines, tough hill tribes like the Equi, the Volsci, and the Samnites raided the Roman plain and contested every pasture, every road, every water source. For the first century of the Republic, Rome was not yet a great power. It was one medium-sized city among many, fighting constantly to protect its lands and expand its territory, winning some battles, losing others, and occasionally facing genuine existential crises. The worst of these early crises came from the north, in the year 390 BCE, when a large force of Celtic Gauls swept southward through Etruria, smashed a Roman army at the river Alaia, and then sacked Rome itself. The Celts held the city for 7 months, before finally accepting a large payment of gold and withdrawing. The Capitoline Hill, defended by a small garrison, held out, saved according to legend, when the geese sacred to Juno raised the alarm one night before a stealthy Gallic assault, waking the sleeping defenders just in time. The Gauls left, but the memory of the sack never did. For the rest of Rome's history, the Gallic sack of 390 was the great national trauma, the catastrophe that Rome had somehow survived, that had burned the old city and somehow made it stronger. Romans rebuilt their city in a hurry after the Gauls left, which is why the street plan of Rome was notoriously chaotic. No time for careful planning when you needed walls back up and houses occupied. But Rome recovered, and then it grew. And it grew in a way that was, in retrospect, remarkable. The key was the gradual reduction of Rome's neighbors one by one. The wars with the Latins, the Volsci, the Aequi, the Etruscans, each conflict was long and grinding, and punctuated by defeats as well as victories. Roman soldiers in this period were not yet the professional legionaries of the later empire. They were citizen soldiers, farmers, who put down their plows when the campaign season opened in spring and marched away to fight, returning in autumn for the harvest. Their campaigns were local at first, rarely taking them more than a week's march from home. Picture a Roman army on the march in the 4th century BCE. The column moves in ordered silence through the oak forests and wheat fields of Latium, the dawn light filtering through the trees. Each man carries his own weapons and provisions, a short sword, a round shield, a helmet of bronze, several days' worth of emmer wheat and dried figs. The centurion at the head of the century, a unit of 80 men, sets a pace that is disciplined but not brutal, aware that his soldiers are also his neighbors. At the end of each day's march, they stop and build a camp, digging a ditch and raising a rampart of earth and timber, even if they plan to stay only a single night. The discipline of the camp, its orderly grid of streets, its assigned positions for each unit, its routine of guards and watches, was as important as the discipline of the battlefield. The 3 great Samnite wars, fought between Rome and the fierce hill tribes of the southern Apennines, from 343 to 290 BCE tested Roman resilience to its limits. In one famous encounter, the Caudine Forks of 321 BCE, an entire Roman army was surrounded in a mountain pass by the Samnites and forced to submit to a humiliating peace. The Romans walked under a yoke, the ultimate symbol of subjugation. Rome was furious. Rome recovered. Rome came back and fought again, and then fought again, until finally the Samnites were defeated and absorbed into the Roman alliance system. The way Rome treated its conquered neighbors was, arguably, its greatest strategic innovation of the early republic. Rome did not simply destroy its enemies. It did not enslave entire peoples or obliterate their identities. Instead, it offered a range of relationships: full citizenship for some, partial citizenship without the voting rights for others, formal alliance status with obligations to provide troops and support in wartime, local autonomy on internal matters. Roman colonies were planted throughout the peninsula. Communities of Roman and Latin citizens settled in strategic locations. Veterans given land in exchange for loyalty. Little Romes embedded in the landscape from the northern plain to the southern coast. The result was a confederation rather than an empire. The Italian peoples were not subjects in the degrading sense, but partners in an enterprise that offered tangible benefits: the protection of Roman military power, access to Roman markets, Roman roads, Roman courts. This system of inclusion, however imperfect, gave Rome something no purely coercive empire could have: a deep reservoir of manpower that it could draw on in times of crisis. Those Roman roads deserve a moment of your attention, because they were extraordinary. The first great road, the Via Appia, the Appian Way, was begun in 312 BCE, cutting southward from Rome toward Capua in a line so straight it seemed to defy the landscape, pushing through hills with cuttings and over valleys with embankments and bridges. Roman roads were not merely paths, they were engineering achievements. They were built in layers, from the deep foundation of large stones through courses of gravel and lime concrete to a surface of fitted stone blocks, cambered slightly in the middle so that rain would run off to the sides rather than pull and damage the road. They were wide enough for 2 carts to pass. They were marked with milestones. They were maintained. A traveler on the Via Appia in the 4th century BCE would have walked on a surface as smooth and durable as anything the ancient world could offer, and would have done so in the knowledge that this road stretched, in both directions, further than the eye could see. By 264 BCE, Rome controlled the entire Italian peninsula south of the Po River. It had not set out to conquer Italy. Conquest happened incrementally, each campaign justified as defensive, each new territory absorbed as a buffer against the next threat, but the result was unambiguous. Rome was now the dominant power in the Italian world, and the Mediterranean was beginning to notice. Part 5. Hannibal and the Punic Wars. Across the water, in a city of magnificent harbors and purple-dyed cloth, of sailing ships and temple towers that were visible from the sea, a great power was watching Rome's rise with growing unease. Carthage. The city of Carthage sat on a promontory of the North African coast, in what is now Tunisia, founded, according to tradition, by Phoenician settlers from the city of Tyre, on the coast of what is now Lebanon. By the 3rd century BCE, Carthage was the commercial heart of the western Mediterranean. Its ships carried the trade of the entire region: Spanish silver and Sardinian grain, North African ivory and Sicilian wheat, tin from Cornwall and glass from the eastern shores. Its walls enclosed a population that may have rivaled Rome's. Its harbor was a masterpiece of engineering, a vast artificial bay ringed with docks and warehouses, where hundreds of warships could be built and maintained simultaneously. Carthage was, above all, a maritime power, a city that lived by and for the sea. The collision between Rome, the great land power, and Carthage, the great sea power, was perhaps inevitable. It came in 3 waves, over a span of more than a century, in a series of conflicts that the Romans called the Punic Wars, Punicus being the Latin adjective for Phoenician, from which the Carthaginians descended. The First Punic War, from 264 to 241 BCE, was triggered by a dispute in Sicily, that large triangular island that sat between the two great powers, like a stepping stone across the Mediterranean. When Rome chose to intervene in a Sicilian quarrel, it found itself at war with Carthage, and immediately discovered that it had no navy. Rome had never needed one. It was a land power. Its genius was the legion, not the trireme. What happened next was one of the most extraordinary acts of military improvisation in ancient history. The Romans captured a Carthaginian warship that had run aground, took it apart, studied its construction, and used it as a template to build a fleet of 120 vessels in less than 2 months. According to some ancient sources, though this number may be optimistic, they also invented a device called the corvus, a boarding bridge that could be dropped onto an enemy vessel, allowing Roman soldiers to fight a naval battle as if it were a land battle, turning the clash of ships into something closer to a close-quarters infantry engagement. With this improvised navy, Rome fought, and lost, and rebuilt and fought again. Across 2 decades of bitter naval warfare, entire fleets were wrecked by storms. Thousands of sailors drowned, years of effort undone by weather in a single night. But Rome persisted with a stubbornness that would come to define its national character. Eventually, in 241 BCE, a Roman fleet defeated the Carthaginian navy at the Battle of the Agates Islands, ending the war. Carthage surrendered Sicily, paid a substantial indemnity, and retreated. But this was only the prelude. The Second Punic War, from 218 to 201 BCE, produced one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in human history, and one of the most vivid stories of adventure and endurance that the ancient world left behind. Its architect was a man named Hannibal Barca. Hannibal was 26 years old when he became commander of the Carthaginian forces in Spain, still young, still burning with the fury of unfinished business. His father, the general Hamilcar Barca, had never forgiven Rome for the humiliation of the First Punic War and had spent years rebuilding Carthaginian power through the conquest of Spain, its silver mines and its tough, fierce soldiers. Hannibal grew up in military camps, learning strategy and command the way other children learned to read. He was fluent in multiple languages. He could ride and fight and think under pressure. He was beloved by his soldiers with a loyalty that would endure through years of hardship no other army in history might have survived. His plan for the Second Punic War was breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its implications. Rather than wait for Rome to come to him, Hannibal would go to Rome. He would march an army from Spain, through Gaul, over the Alps and directly into the Italian peninsula, striking at Rome in its own homeland, forcing the Romans to fight a defensive war on their own soil and winning over Rome's Italian allies by demonstrating that Rome was not invincible. In the spring of 218 BCE, Hannibal set out with approximately 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 African war elephants. Let that image settle for a moment. 37 elephants, great grey creatures from the forests of North Africa, their skin rough as bark, their footsteps heavy as thunder, following an army through landscapes they had never seen, and into mountains that no army had ever dared. The Pyrenees first, where hostile mountain tribes had to be fought and bribed and negotiated with. Then the wide sweep of southern Gaul, the valley of the Rhone, its current swift and cold, where Hannibal organized an extraordinary river crossing for his army. Horses on boats, elephants floated across on great earth-covered rafts, the animals' confusion and fear managed by the Remahouts with practiced expertise. Then the Alps. The exact route Hannibal took through the Alps has been debated for more than 2,000 years. Ancient accounts from Polybius and Livy describe the landscape in tantalizing but imprecise terms. A great cliff, a place where the snow was deep and rotten beneath the fresh fall, a descent more treacherous than the ascent. Modern researchers examining sediment cores from a high alpine bog have found evidence of massive animal disturbance and churned up earth from the late 3rd century BCE, consistent with the passage of a large army at a pass called the Col de la Traversette, near the border of France and Italy. It was in September, and the early mountain snows had already fallen. The crossing took 15 days. Imagine the sound and smell of that army moving through the high mountains, the thin, ice-edged air of altitude, the creak of leather harness and the clank of bronze, the grunting complaint of horses on steep rocky paths, the quiet, eerie sounds of the elephants, those vast, cold-adapted ancestors of African forest elephants, navigating switchbacks and snowfields, their great round feet surprisingly careful on the broken terrain. And below and ahead, through gaps in the cloud, the distant gleam of the Italian plain, the land they had come so far to reach. They arrived in Italy with approximately 26,000 men remaining, perhaps half the army that had set out. The mountains had taken thousands, but those who remained were veterans hardened to an extraordinary degree, bound to their commander by shared suffering, ready to fight. And fight they did, in 3 catastrophic encounters: at the Trebbia River in December 218, at Lake Trasimene in April 217, and most devastatingly at Cannae in August 216. Hannibal destroyed Roman army after Roman army, killing tens of thousands. The Battle of Cannae in particular is studied in military academies to this day. Facing a larger Roman force, Hannibal arranged his center to be deliberately weak, allowing the Roman legions to push through, and then closed his stronger wings around both sides of the advancing Romans, enveloping them in a pocket from which there was no escape. Perhaps 50,000 Romans died in a single afternoon. The ground was red. The Roman Senate sat in near silence when the news reached the city. But Rome did not surrender. This is perhaps the most important thing about the Second Punic War, and about Rome itself. Facing the greatest military defeat in its history, facing an enemy general of genius camped on Italian soil, Rome refused to ask for terms. It raised new armies, appointed new generals, and changed its strategy, keeping its forces out of open battle with Hannibal wherever possible, harassing his supply lines, besieging his allies, waiting. The strategy is named after Quintus Fabius Maximus, the Roman dictator who employed it, and it earned him the nickname Cunctator, the delayer. His fellow Romans found it humiliating and cowardly. He persisted, and he was right. While Hannibal marched through Italy, winning battles he could not follow up, watching his grand coalition of Roman allies fail to materialize, losing men and equipment he could not replace. A young Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio took the war to Spain, then to Africa. He threatened Carthage itself. Hannibal was recalled from Italy in 233 BCE, returning to a homeland he had not seen in 15 years. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, Scipio defeated Hannibal, taking away the Carthaginian cavalry advantage through superior tactics, neutralizing the elephants and using Hannibal's own encirclement strategy against him. Carthage surrendered. It paid enormous reparations. It was stripped of its navy and its overseas territories. Scipio returned to Rome in triumph and was given the honorary title Africanus. Hannibal survived the war and spent his final years as a fugitive, hunted by Roman demands for his arrest. He died in exile, refusing to be taken. In 183 BCE, he never returned to Carthage. The Mediterranean world was changed forever. Rome was no longer merely an Italian power. It was the dominant force in the Western Mediterranean, and its eyes were already turning east. Part 6. Daily Life in Ancient Rome. Let us leave the battlefield now and come home. Walk with me down a narrow street in Rome at the hour just after dawn, when the city is beginning to wake. The air is cool and carries the smell of bread baking in a nearby Thermopolium, one of the thousands of small food stalls and taverns that lined Rome's streets. The cooking smell is rich and warm, olive oil and spices, garlic, and the faint char of a fire stoked early. From an upstairs window, a woman shakes out a blanket. A slave hurries past, with a large amphora on his shoulder, its clay sides still cool and sweating from a cellar night. A dog picks his way along the gutter. Rome was a city of perhaps 1 million people at its height, the first city in the Western world to reach that number, and it was crowded in a way that is almost impossible to imagine from quiet modern streets. Most Romans did not live in the palatial houses that survive in tourist photographs. Most Romans lived in insulae, apartment blocks of several stories, sometimes as many as 6 or 7, their upper floors reached by steep wooden staircases, their walls thin enough that you could hear your neighbors' arguments and laughter and the sounds of their sleep. The poorest Romans lived in the highest floors, furthest from the street and most vulnerable if fire broke out below. These rooms were small, sometimes a single space for an entire family, with no kitchen, no running water, and no private toilet. You collected water in a jug from the public fountain at the corner. You used the public latrine down the street, a long stone bench with holes, running water below, often a cheerful social venue, where neighbors met and talked. For cooking, you used a brazier of hot coals on your windowsill, or more likely, you simply bought your food ready-made from the street. The wealthy lived differently. A prosperous Roman family might occupy a domus, a proper private house centered on an atrium, a rectangular room open to the sky, its floor inlaid with colored marble or intricate mosaic, its walls painted with frescoes in deep red and ochre and dusty blue. Beyond the atrium was the tablinum, the master's study, and beyond that a peristyle garden, a colonnaded courtyard where roses and herbs and fruit trees grew, where a small fountain splashed in the center, where children played in the shade of the afternoon. The wealthy Roman house turned its back on the noisy street and looked inward toward its own private world. But rich or poor, Roman daily life followed a similar rhythm. You woke early, very early. Romans divided the day into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of night, which meant that a summer hour was long and a winter hour was short. In any season, the first hour of daylight was considered the time to begin work, and in the dim light of early morning, the city was already busy. The curfew on wheeled traffic, carts and wagons were banned from the streets of Rome during daytime to prevent gridlock, so all deliveries happened at night, meant that the pre-dawn hours were noisy with rumbling wheels and the voices of drivers, and Romans who lived near main roads rarely slept undisturbed through the night. Breakfast was light, or sometimes skipped entirely, a piece of bread, perhaps dipped in olive oil, or spread with honey, a handful of olives or figs, a cup of water or diluted wine. Romans ate simply in the morning, saving their appetite. Work began with the light. Rome had a vast and varied economy. There were bakers and butchers, jewelers and cobblers, fullers who cleaned wool cloth using a combination of human urine and threading, their great wooden vats a permanent feature of every Roman neighborhood. There were lawyers and teachers, doctors and astrologers, scribes who wrote letters for the illiterate, fortune tellers who read the future in the entrails of birds or the chrysalis of a palm. There were slaves who constituted perhaps a quarter of the city's population, enslaved through war, through birth, through death, working in households and workshops and mines and ships, performing every kind of labor from the most brutal to the most skilled, their lives shaped entirely by the temperament and needs of the people who owned them. The forum was the center of public life, and on a busy morning it was extraordinarily alive. Lawyers argued before the rostra, merchants discussed prices, politicians clustered in the shade of temple porticos, exchanging whispers and rumors. A schoolmaster had set up in a corner of the square, his students sitting on low stools in the open air, writing letters in wax tablets with a stylus, the scratch and squeak of their work audible over the surrounding noise. A philosopher was declaiming at a small crowd who had paused on their way to somewhere else. Around midday, the 6th hour, the tempo of the city shifted. Work paused. The wealthy went home for lunch, a more substantial meal than breakfast. Eggs, olives, salted fish, bread, fresh vegetables, some hard cheese, washed down with wine, heavily diluted with water. Romans who drank undiluted wine were considered barbarians. The poor ate at the Thermopolia, the food stalls whose stone counters still survive in the excavated cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. The circular holes in their tops once holding clay pots of hot stew and porridge and wine. And then, in the afternoon, after a rest, the practice of a midday nap was widespread and socially acceptable. Most Romans of any class did the same thing. They went to the baths. The public baths of Rome, the thermae, were among the most remarkable social institutions the ancient world produced, and nothing quite like them has existed since. Entry was cheap, sometimes free. Anyone, from the wealthiest senator to the humblest freed slave, could walk through the doors of a public bathhouse and spend several hours in a progression of heated rooms, from the cool frigidarium to the warm tepidarium to the hot caldarium. sweating, scraping their skin clean with a curved metal tool called a strigil, swimming in pools, exercising in the palestra, getting massages from attendants, having their hair cut, reading in a small library, eating a snack from a vendor in the portico. The great imperial baths of the later empire were almost impossibly lavish. The baths of Caracalla covered 27 acres and could accommodate 1,600 bathers simultaneously. Their halls soaring to vaulted ceilings decorated with mosaics, their walls sheathed in colored marble, their gardens laid out with fountains and statuary. But even the smaller neighborhood baths of the early empire were comfortable and well maintained, heated by an underfloor hypocaust system, a Roman invention still used in principle in modern radiant floor heating, that circulated hot air through hollow bricks beneath the floors and inside the walls. The baths were not merely about hygiene, they were where business got done, where friendships were maintained, where gossip traveled its fastest, where you might run into your neighbor or your patron or a man you had been trying to speak to for a week. They were one of the places where the usually rigid social hierarchy of Rome softened slightly. Not eliminated, never eliminated, but softened. You could not tell a senator from a freedman when both were naked. Children in Rome lived lives of vivid sensory richness. Wealthy children had toys, carved wooden horses, jointed dolls with real hair, small animals in bronze and ivory. They flew kites and bowled hoops through the streets. They chased each other through the alleyways and climbed the stone seats of the theater when performances were not in progress. They learned their letters from a grammaticus, who beat them without compunction when their recitation was poor, and they worked their way through the approved texts of Virgil and Cicero until those words were as familiar as bread. Mealtimes in a wealthy household, especially the great dinner parties, the cena, held in the triclinium, the dining room, were elaborate affairs. Guests reclined on couches arranged in a U-shape around low tables, eating with their fingers from shared dishes. The slaves bringing course after course from the kitchen. Roman aristocratic cuisine was extraordinary. Recipes surviving from Apicius, a Roman food writer of the early imperial period, call for remarkable combinations of sweet, sour, and pungent flavors. A sauce made of fish, fermented until liquid, called garum, which smelled terrible and tasted remarkable, underpinned almost every complex dish in Roman cooking. Outside on the streets, away from the dinner parties of the wealthy, ordinary Romans sat at the entrances of their apartment buildings in the warm evenings, talking with neighbors, watching the last light fade from the sky above the rooftops, listening to the city settle into its nighttime sounds. The Tiber moved on, as it always had. The stars came out over the 7 hills. Another day in Rome was ending. Part 7. Julius Caesar. There are figures in history who seem to compress the energies of an entire age into a single human life, who move through the world so intensely that they leave a mark on everything they touch, and whose deaths echo louder than most men's lives. Julius Caesar was one of these. He was born in 100 BCE into the ancient patrician family of the Julii, a family that claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself, though by Caesar's generation, the family was more distinguished in name than in wealth. Rome was already convulsing under the pressures of the late Republic, social conflicts, economic inequality, the strains of governing a vast Mediterranean empire through institutions designed for a small city-state. The generation before Caesar's had seen the murders of the reforming tribunes Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, the brutal proscriptions of the dictator Sulla, the slave revolt of Spartacus. Caesar grew up in the Subura, a dense, raucous, working-class neighborhood near the Forum, and he never entirely lost the common touch he developed there. He was charming in the way that great politicians are charming, genuinely interested in people, genuinely good at making each person he spoke to feel like the most important person in the room. He was also a writer of extraordinary clarity. His accounts of the Gallic Wars, written in the third person, as if reporting on someone else's achievements, remain models of Latin prose 2000 years later. His rise was calculated and relentless. He served his political apprenticeship through the standard magistracies, quaestor, edile, during which he funded spectacular public games with borrowed money, making himself enormously popular, praetor and finally consul in 59 BCE, the highest office of the Republic. He was funny, sexually charismatic, and completely ruthless when ruthlessness was required. He borrowed enormous sums of money and spent it all on buying political support. He formed a secret political alliance, the First Triumvirate, with the two most powerful men in Rome, the immensely wealthy Marcus Crassus and the celebrated general Pompey the Great. From the consulship, Caesar arranged for himself the command of the provinces of Gaul, both the settled Roman Gaul in the south of modern France and the wild, unconquered lands to the north and west, home to the Gallic tribes whose ancestors had sacked Rome 3 centuries earlier. For 10 years, from 58 to 49 BCE, Caesar fought his way through what is now France, Belgium, Switzerland, parts of Germany, and even twice across the Channel to Britain. The Gallic Wars were brutal and brilliant in equal measure. Caesar defeated tribe after tribe, constructed bridges across wide rivers in days, besieged entire towns, and twice crossed the English Channel, the first Roman commander to do so. He crushed the great Gallic revolt of Vercingetorix at the Siege of Alesia in 52 BCE, surrounding the Gauls' hilltop fortress with an outer ring of fortifications, while simultaneously building an outer circle to keep a Gallic relief army at bay. He was fighting an inner battle simultaneously, the battle for political relevance and survival back in Rome. He wrote his war dispatches in clear, gripping prose, dispatching them south, so that Romans who had never seen Gaul could read about his victories, his legions crossing rivers and entering mysterious forests, his encounters with the strange blue-painted peoples of Britain. He became famous, he became beloved by his legions, who called him the bold seducer, with an affection that made the insult a compliment. And then, in 50 BCE, the alliance that had sustained him collapsed. Crassus was dead, killed at the Battle of Carrhae against the Parthians. Pompey, now close to the Senate faction that feared Caesar, turned against his former ally. The Senate ordered Caesar to surrender his command and return to Rome as a private citizen, which would have left him exposed to prosecution by enemies who had been waiting years for just this opportunity. Caesar understood the situation with perfect clarity. To disband his army and return to Rome was to submit to destruction. To keep his army and cross back into Italy was to declare a war on the Republic. On a cold and damp night in January 49 BCE, Julius Caesar stood on the north bank of a small river in northern Italy, the Rubicon, which marked the legal boundary of his province. Across the river lay Italy proper, and beyond it, Rome. Roman law was absolute on this point. A general could not bring his army across the Rubicon. To do so was treason. He hesitated, he paced, he spoke with his officers. The ancient sources give us different versions of what he said in that moment, but the most famous is simply this: Alea iacta est. The die is cast. He crossed. The civil war began. The war was swift and decisive. Pompey and the Senate fled Italy, then fled to Greece, then to Egypt, where Pompey was murdered on a beach by agents of the Egyptian king, who hoped thereby to curry favor with the seemingly inevitable victor. Caesar arrived in Egypt shortly after, wept when he was shown Pompey's severed head, and then met the young Egyptian Queen Cleopatra, who had herself smuggled to him, rolled inside a rug or carpet. A story that may be somewhat embellished, but is too good to let go entirely. He defeated the remaining Pompeian forces at Pharsalu and Thapsus and Munda. He returned to Rome as the undisputed master of the Roman world. He was appointed dictator, an ancient Roman office intended for use in genuine emergency, normally limited to 6 months, but Caesar accepted a dictatorship without the time limit. He reformed the Roman calendar, giving us the Julian calendar that, with modest adjustments, is still the calendar most of the world uses today. He cancelled debts, established colonies for his veterans, improved the grain supply, extended Roman citizenship throughout Italy and beyond. But he made enemies as fast as he made reforms. The Republicans, the men who genuinely believed in the ideals of the Republic, even if those ideals had become somewhat notional in practice, watched with horror as Caesar accepted honors that seemed to tremble on the edge of divine kingship. He was called the father of the fatherland. His birthday was made a public holiday. His image was placed among those of the gods. Rumors circulated, perhaps encouraged by his enemies, that he intended to declare himself king. On the 8th of March, the 15th of 44 BCE, Caesar walked to a meeting of the Senate in the portico attached to the theater of Pompey, near the Campus Martius. A group of conspirators, between 20 and 60 men, had concealed daggers beneath their togas. Among them was Marcus Junius Brutus, Caesar's friend, whom Caesar had once pardoned after the civil war and elevated to high office. When the conspirators surrounded Caesar and began to stab him, Caesar is said to have covered his face with his toga, and when he saw a Brutus among his attackers, to have said only quietly, "You too, child." He died of 23 stab wounds. The republic he embodied was dead already. His murder only confirmed it. Part 8. Augustus and the birth of the empire. Caesar's death did not restore the republic. It ignited another civil war. The conspirators who had killed Caesar assumed, incorrectly, fatally, that the Roman people would celebrate their act as the liberation of the republic. Instead, the people of Rome were angry. Caesar had been popular. Caesar had given them games and grain and the hope of something better. And Caesar had left behind in his will a young man of 19 years named Gaius Octavius, his adopted heir. Octavian, as he was then called, was not a soldier. He was thin and frequently ill and had no military experience, but he was intelligent with an almost supernatural patience. And he understood power the way a craftsman understands his tools. Completely, precisely, without illusion. He allied himself first with Mark Antony, Caesar's old lieutenant, and with Lepidus, another powerful general, forming the second triumvirate. Together they hunted down Caesar's killers, defeating Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. Then, as triumvirates always do, this one began to fracture. The fracture between Octavian and Antony followed a geographic line. Octavian in the west, commanding Italy and the western provinces, and Antony in the east, where he had become the ally and lover of Cleopatra VII of Egypt, the last great independent power in the Mediterranean world. When Antony and Cleopatra were defeated at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE and then committed suicide in Egypt, Octavian stood alone. And then he did something brilliant. He didn't declare himself king. He didn't demand a crown. He went to the Senate in January of 27 BCE and announced that he was returning all his extraordinary powers to the Senate and people of Rome. The Republic was restored. The Senate, populated largely by his supporters and aware of what the alternative might be, responded with lavish honors. They gave him the name Augustus, the revered one, and assembled for him a carefully constructed package of powers: command of the key provinces, where the legions were stationed, tribunician power giving him veto rights and the protection of the plebs, and an authority that was supreme in practice, while remaining technically bounded by tradition and law. He called himself princeps, first citizen, not king, not dictator, citizen. It was the most successful political fiction in history. Augustus ruled for 41 years, the longest reign in Roman imperial history, and in that time he transformed Rome at every level. He found Rome, he said, a city of brick, and left it a city of marble. And the boast was nearly true. The Forum of Augustus, the Temple of Mars Ultor, the Arapacis, the Campus Martius, rebuilt as a grand civic park with mausoleum and sundial and altar of peace. Rome became a city worthy of an empire. He reformed the army, reducing the bloated post-Civil War force from 60 legions to 28, settling hundreds of thousands of veterans in colonies throughout Italy and the provinces. He created the Praetorian Guard, an elite force stationed near Rome as the emperor's personal protection. He established a permanent fire brigade, a police force, a postal service of relay stations that could carry a message from Rome to the frontiers in a matter of days. He secured the frontiers, the Rhine and Danube as at Rome's northern boundaries in Europe, the Euphrates as the eastern border with Parthia, the edge of the Sahara as the southern limit of Roman Egypt. One disaster marked his reign. In 9 CE, 3 entire Roman legions were ambushed and annihilated in the Teutoburg forest of Germany by Germanic warriors led by a chieftain named Arminius. Augustus reportedly walked the corridors of his palace for weeks afterward, banging his head against the wall and crying out, "Varus, give me back my legions." The Rhine, not the Elbe, would remain Rome's German border. But in Italy and the older provinces, the Pax Augusta, the peace of Augustus, settled over the land like a warm and beneficent stillness. Trade flourished, cities grew, the arts bloomed. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, Rome's national epic, the story of the Trojan hero Aeneas sailing west to found the people who would one day build Rome under the patronage of Augustus himself. Horace wrote his odes, Livy wrote his history, Ovid wrote his beautiful, sometimes scandalous poetry. Augustus died in 14 CE at the age of 75, an extraordinary age in the ancient world, in a small town in Campania, reportedly holding his wife Livia's hand. His last words, according to Suetonius, were addressed to his friends. "Have I played my part in the comedy of life skillfully enough? If so, give me applause as I exit." The empire wept, and then, with the practiced smoothness of a machine its creator had designed, power passed to his stepson Tiberius. The Pax Romana had begun. Part 9. Life during the Roman Empire. There is a particular quality to the world that Rome created at its height, a quality of interconnectedness, of an almost modern sense of being part of something vast and functioning and humming with life, that has rarely been matched in the 1200 years of its absence. Consider what it meant to travel in the Roman Empire at the height of the Pax Romana. You could walk out of the city of Rome and step onto the Via Appia, and if you kept walking south, you would eventually reach the hill of Italy, where ships sailed regularly to Greece. If you walked north on the Via Flaminia, you would cross the Apennines and descend into the Po Valley, and from there roads stretched north and east toward the Alps and beyond into Gaul and the Rhine frontier, into the British Isles and the cold northern coast of the province of Britannia. If you sailed east from Brindisi, you could reach Athens in a few days, Alexandria in a week, and from Alexandria, if you chose, you could sail south down the Red Sea on trading vessels that called at ports in Arabia and India. The Roman road network, at its greatest extent, covered roughly 50,000 miles of paved road, more than twice the circumference of the Earth, radiating outward from a single golden milestone in the Forum in the center of Rome. Every road was built to the same specifications, marked with milestones indicating distances, and maintained by the local communities through which it passed. Bridges of stone and concrete spanned every significant river. Rest houses, called mansiones, were spaced roughly a day's journey apart, providing lodging, food, and fresh horses for official travelers. Travel was still uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous. Bandits operated along the less traveled roads, and sea voyages were always vulnerable to storm and shipwreck. But within the core of the empire, travel was safer and more reliable than it would be anywhere in Europe for the next 1500 years. A Roman governor with urgent business could ride from Britain to Rome in less than 2 weeks. The empire's cities were connected by more than roads. They were connected by law, by language, by currency, by a shared culture that stretched from Britain to Syria but maintained its Roman character everywhere it went. In Timgad, in what is now Algeria, you can still walk the streets of a Roman city laid out to the same grid plan as Rome itself. Forum, basilica, baths, theatre, colonnaded main street, neighborhood taverns. In Bath, in England, Roman engineers built an elaborate complex of baths over a natural hot spring, adding a temple and a great hall, whose architecture would not have looked out of place in the capital. In Ephesus, in what is now Turkey, the Roman street of the Curetes was lined with marble-fronted shops and public fountains, its library one of the largest in the ancient world. Wherever Rome went, it built. It built because building was power, a permanent assertion of Roman presence, Roman values, Roman order. But it also built because Romans genuinely believed in the things they built, in the value of clean water, of good roads, of public space, of places where the community could meet and wash and eat and do business. The aqueducts deserve particular attention, as perhaps the most purely magnificent expression of Roman engineering ambition. Rome at its height was served by 11 separate aqueducts, drawing water from springs and rivers in the Apennine Hills and carrying it into the city across distances of up to 87 miles, using gravity alone to maintain a constant gentle slope. The combined length of Rome's aqueducts was nearly 260 miles. Most of this distance ran underground or along the surface, but where valleys intervened, the aqueducts were carried on great arched bridges, arcades of stone, whose proportions are as beautiful today as they were functional then. The Pont du Gard in southern France, built to carry water to the Roman city of Nîmes, rises to nearly 160 feet on 3 tiers of arches and stands today in almost perfect condition after 2000 years. At its destination, a Roman aqueduct fed a distribution system of lead and ceramic pipes that carried water to public fountains throughout the city, to the baths, to the houses of the wealthy, and to certain industries. Ordinary Romans collected their water from the public fountains, where it ran continuously, excess water flowing into the sewers and maintaining the Cloaca Maxima's flow. Rome had, in effect, the first urban water infrastructure in history, and it gave the city a quality of life and a population density that would not be matched in Europe again until the 19th century. Trade moved along those same roads and sea lanes, and the scale of it was extraordinary. Grain arrived in Rome by sea from Egypt and North Africa in enormous quantities. The city required perhaps 200,000 tons of grain per year to feed its population, and almost none of it was grown locally. Spanish olive oil and wine traveled north and east in the distinctive barrel-shaped amphoras that archaeologists find in every Roman province. British tin and wool went south. Eastern silks and spices arrived from India and beyond, carried by merchants who navigated the monsoon winds across the Indian Ocean in vessels that Romans never built but gladly used. African ivory and wild animals traveled north to supply the arenas. The Roman standard currency, the gold aureus, the silver denarius, the bronze sestertius, gave this trade its skeleton. A merchant in Lugdunum, modern Lyon, who sold a shipment of wine to a buyer in Londinium, modern London, could price the transaction in the same coins that a merchant in Alexandria used to buy Indian pepper. The monetary economy was not unlimited. Large parts of the empire, particularly in the countryside, still operated largely through barter and in-kind payments. But within the cities and along the main trade routes, the denarius was universal. Life in the imperial cities of the provinces was remarkably similar to life in Rome itself. The day began with work, paused at midday, resumed in the afternoon, and ended at the baths. The forum of every provincial town had its courts and its curia, its temples and its arcades of shops. The standard entertainments, theater, gladiatorial games, chariot racing, were available in towns of any significant size. By the 2nd century CE, nearly every Roman city of 10,000 or more inhabitants had its own amphitheater. In the countryside, things were quieter. The great villas of the wealthy were islands of Roman comfort in the wider agricultural world, their triclinia frescoed, their gardens formal, their underfloor heating running in winter, but the farms that surrounded them, worked by slaves or tenant farmers or free smallholders, were subject to the rhythms of the seasons in ways that no urban sophistication could change. Olives were pressed in autumn, grapes were harvested in September, wheat was sown in October, harvested in June. The pastoral year cycled on, generation after generation, under the wide blue skies of the Mediterranean world. This was Rome at its best, not Rome, the military machine, not Rome, the political theater, but Rome, the civilized world, the place where most people, most of the time, were simply living. Part 10. Gladiators and Entertainment. Romans loved spectacle, not quietly, not privately, not as a guilty pleasure. Openly, enthusiastically, collectively. The games, the ludi, were an expression of Roman civic identity, a shared experience that crossed every social boundary and united senator and plebeian, wealthy matron and common laborer in the common currency of excitement and release. The most famous of all Roman entertainment venues was, of course, the Colosseum. Its real name was the Flavian Amphitheater, built by the emperors Vespasian and his son Titus on the site of Nero's private lake, demolished to give the Roman people a monument to public rather than imperial pleasure. Construction began around 70 CE and the Colosseum was inaugurated with 100 days of games in 80 CE. It was the largest amphitheater ever built in the Roman world, capable of holding somewhere between 50 and 80,000 spectators. Its tiers of stone seats, rising to a height of nearly 160 feet, its oval plan measuring roughly 620 by 510 feet. The engineering was spectacular. 80 arched entrances arranged around the perimeter meant that the entire audience could enter and exit in 20 minutes, better than most modern sports stadiums. An elaborate system of corridors, staircases and vaulted passages beneath the seating allowed different social groups to be separated and seated without meeting. Senators and Vestal virgins in the front rows, then equestrians, then common citizens, then women and slaves at the very top. Above the highest tier, poles supported the velarium, an enormous canvas awning that could be extended to shade the audience from the summer sun, controlled by a crew of sailors from the imperial fleet who were specially assigned to the task. The shows held in the Colosseum were varied. The most famous were the gladiatorial combats, carefully choreographed, though genuinely dangerous, performances in which trained professional fighters faced each other in matches whose outcomes were governed by codes of honor and crowd response. Gladiators were, by Roman standards, culturally complex figures. They were mostly slaves or condemned criminals, the lowest of the low, and yet they were also celebrities, their images painted on walls and their names inscribed on graffiti throughout the city. Admired for their courage and skill, sometimes genuinely loved by audiences who had watched them survive match after match over years. The types of gladiator were varied and ritualized. The heavily armed secutor, whose round helmet and large shield made him slow but well protected. The nimble retiarius, who fought with a trident and a weighted net, trying to entangle his opponent before stabbing him. The Trex with his curved sickle sword. The hoplomachus in Greek-style armor. These pairings were traditional, each type designed to counterbalance the other in interesting ways. A match between a secutor and a retiarius was a match between weight and speed, between enclosure and evasion. Death was not as common in the arena as modern imagination tends to assume. Trained gladiators were expensive investments. A good fighter who died at every second bout was not a financially viable proposition. When a fighter was knocked down and unable to continue, he could appeal for mercy by raising a finger. The crowd would signal its verdict. Exactly which gestures meant what is still debated by scholars, and the emperor or presiding official would make the final decision. Mercy was granted more often than you might expect. A fighter who had given an exciting show, who had displayed courage, even in defeat, often received the crowd's generosity. Beyond gladiatorial combat, the amphitheater hosted animal hunts, venaciones, in which exotic creatures from the far corners of the empire were displayed and hunted. Lions and leopards from Africa, bears from the northern forests, crocodiles from Egypt, ostriches and giraffes that the crowd had never seen before. These events were as much about imperial geography as entertainment, Rome showing off the breadth of its reach, demonstrating that every creature on earth was ultimately subject to Roman command. But the gladiatorial games were only the most spectacular of Roman entertainments. The most popular in terms of sheer numbers were the chariot races. The Circus Maximus, the great racing track that occupied the valley between the Palatine and Aventine Hills, was the largest stadium in the ancient world and remained one of the largest structures ever built by humans until the modern era. At its greatest extent, it held approximately 250,000 spectators, roughly a quarter of Rome's entire population, watching 7 lap races around the central spina, a long low barrier decorated with obelisks and bronze dolphins that served as lap counters. Chariot racing was organized into 4 teams, distinguished by their colors: the blues, the greens, the reds, and the whites. Romans followed their teams with a passionate partisanship that modern sports fans would recognize immediately. Graffiti on the walls of Pompeii recorded the wins and losses of famous charioteers in careful tally marks. Supporters of rival teams sometimes came to blows in the streets. Emperors who favored the wrong team could find it affected their popularity. The great charioteer Diocles, who competed in the 2nd century CE, was probably the highest earning athlete in ancient history. His recorded winnings amount to 35 million sesterces. Roman theatres offered a third form of entertainment, somewhat more sedate but equally well attended. Comedy and tragedy were both performed, but comedy, particularly the works of Plautus and Terence, which drew on Greek New Comedy for their plots, but translated them into an energetically Roman idiom, was overwhelmingly the most popular form. The characters were recognizable: the clever slave, the foolish old father, the young man in love, the wily merchant. The jokes were often bawdy, the timing was everything. Theater buildings were magnificent structures, their semicircular seating carved into hillsides or built up on great concrete vaults, their stage buildings rising to 3 stories of marble columns and architectural ornament. The Theatre of Marcellus in Rome, built by Augustus and named for his nephew, could seat 14,000 spectators. In the Theatre of Aspendos, in what is now Turkey, rebuilt in the 2nd century CE, the stage building is so well preserved that it hosts concerts and opera performances today. Entertainment was not separate from Roman civic and religious life. It was embedded in it. Most of the ludi, the public games, were held as offerings to the gods, timed to religious festivals, paid for by the state or by ambitious magistrates who knew that a good show was the fastest route to the crowd's goodwill. To provide magnificent games was an act of generosity, of patronage, of civic pride. To watch them was a way of being Roman together. Part 11. The Roman army at its peak. At the heart of everything Rome built and everything Rome was, its empire, its roads, its cities, its peace, lay the legion. The Roman army at the height of the empire was not a mob or a rabble or a mass of conscripts pushed unwillingly to war. It was a professional institution, disciplined, organized, drilled to a precision that would have impressed a modern engineer, sustained by pay and pensions, and the powerful bonds of brotherhood that form between men who shared hard years together. A legionary soldier at the height of the empire signed on for 25 years. 25 years. He would join at perhaps 17 or 18 as a young man still growing into his height, and if he survived wounds and illness and the 1,000 dangers of a soldier's life, he would retire in his early 40s with a pension or a grant of land, his citizenship confirmed, his identity defined by those decades of service. To become a legionary, you first had to be a Roman citizen, a requirement that excluded much of the empire's population. Though as citizenship spread, it became easier to meet. You had to be physically capable, tall enough, with good eyesight, and no significant physical defects. Recruits from rural areas were preferred over city dwellers, who were considered too soft. The process of enlistment was medical, administrative, and ritualistic. You swore an oath, the sacramentum, that bound you to the emperor and to Rome, with a solemnity that was not merely legal but religious. To break the oath was to invite not just military punishment but divine retribution. And then the training began. The training of a Roman legionary was systematic and demanding in a way that few armies before or since have matched. It began with marching, the fundamental skill of the Roman army. Recruits were expected to march 20 Roman miles, roughly 18 modern miles, in 5 hours wearing full kit, and 30 Roman miles, 27 modern miles, in the same time on a forced march. The kit weighed more than 60 Roman pounds. Helmet, armor, shield, 2 javelins, short sword, personal equipment, and a wooden stake for fortifications. The men called themselves Marius's mules, after the general who had standardized the load, and the name carried a resigned affection. Weapons training was conducted with wooden practice swords and wicker shields that were deliberately heavier than the real equipment, the theory being that when the soldier finally picked up his actual gladius and scotum, they would feel almost light. Soldiers practiced against a wooden post, called a palus, striking and thrusting in specific patterns, until the movements became automatic, as natural as breathing. They learned to fight in formation, to hold the line under pressure, to advance and retreat in order, to use the large rectangular shield not just as a defense, but as a weapon, punching it forward into an enemy's face, while the short sword stabbed low below the rim. They learned to build. This is perhaps the most surprising aspect of the Roman soldier's life. the extent to which he was also an engineer. At the end of every day's march, even a march of only a few hours, the legionaries constructed a full marching camp. They dug a ditch around a rectangular perimeter, piled the earth inward to form a rampart, and erected wooden stakes along the rampart's top as a palisade. Inside, the camp was laid out to a standard plan. The legate's headquarters in the center, the streets of the contubernium tents on either side, the hospital, the workshops, the granary. A soldier who had served 20 years could arrive at any marching camp anywhere in the empire and know exactly where everything was. It was a city of cloth and wood that appeared overnight and disappeared the next morning, leaving only a slight depression in the earth. In permanent forts and fortresses along the frontiers, the architecture was stone, the permanence intended. Hadrian's Wall, stretching 80 miles across northern Britain from the Solway Firth to the Tyne, built between 122 and 128 a CE at the order of Emperor Hadrian, was the most spectacular frontier fortification in the Roman world, but it was one of many. From the Rhine to the Danube to the edge of the Syrian desert, Rome ringed its empire with a system of walls and forts and watchtowers and supply roads, the whole system called the limes, the frontier. Life at a frontier fort had a quality of profound routine that is almost meditative in its orderliness. The day began before dawn with the signal of the buccina, a curved bronze horn, sounding the morning call. Soldiers turned out for morning assembly, received the day's watchword and their duties, and then dispersed to training, labor, guard duty, or administrative tasks. Every day, without exception, there was training, marching, weapons practice, swimming, riding for the cavalry auxiliary units. Every week, there was a route march. Every month, a full-scale field exercise. Work was constant, repairing roads, maintaining the wall, carrying supplies, escorting tax collectors, building new structures. Roman soldiers built temples for their gods, theaters for their entertainment, baths for their hygiene. Inscriptions left by soldiers on stone tablets along Hadrian's Wall record who built each section, which century, which cohort, with a specificity that archaeologists still find invaluable today. The diet was surprisingly good. Wheat, barley, lentils and other legumes, olive oil, salt, vinegar mixed with water to make posca, the standard army beverage, occasional meat, cheese when available. Soldiers prepared their own food, cooking in the fire pits of their tent groups, the contubernium of 8 men who shared a tent on the march and a barrack room in permanent quarters. The preparation and sharing of food was one of the bonds that held these small groups together. Off-duty life had its pleasures. Gambling was technically prohibited, but universally practiced. Dice and gaming boards have been found throughout Roman military sites. Beer was drunk in the regions where wine was unavailable. The Vici, civilian settlements that grew up outside every permanent fort, offered shops and taverns and the company of women who had followed or accompanied the army, many of whom were in long-term relationships with soldiers and raised families in the shadow of the walls, in a legal grey zone that was eventually regularized by allowing soldiers to have de facto families, even if formal marriage remained technically forbidden during service. The soldiers who served on the most distant frontiers, in the rain-soaked hill country of northern Britain, on the freezing Danube plain, in winter, in the baking desert border between Roman Syria and the Parthian Empire, were far from home in ways that are sometimes staggering to contemplate. An inscription from Vindolanda, a fort just south of Hadrian's Wall, records a letter from a soldier to his family in North Africa, describing the cold and wet of the British winter in terms of weary, homesick wonder. Another letter, found at the same site, is from a mother sending her son socks and underpants, and asking if he has received the food she sent. Even at the edge of the world, soldiers were still people who wanted warm feet and a letter from home. Part 12. Crisis of the 3rd century. For nearly 200 years, from Augustus to Marcus Aurelius, the Roman Empire functioned with something approaching the stability its creators had designed it for. Emperors succeeded one another, sometimes smoothly, sometimes not. But the machinery of administration, the army, the roads, the trade, continued. Cities were built, philosophers wrote, the Pax Romana held. Then, in the year 235 CE, something broke. the crisis of the 3rd century. The period, roughly from 235 to 284 CE, was not a single dramatic catastrophe. It was a long, grinding deterioration, a slow unraveling of the systems that held the empire together, like a garment that develops a small tear and then, under continued stress, begins to come apart along its seams. The immediate trigger was the assassination of Emperor Alexander Severus by his own soldiers in 235 CE. Alexander had been trying to buy peace with Germanic tribes on the Rhine frontier rather than fight them, and his troops, who had joined the army to fight, found this policy both humiliating and financially unprofitable. A giant soldier of Thracian peasant origin named Maximinus Thrax, Maximinus the Thracian, was proclaimed emperor by the legions on the spot. What followed over the next 50 years was a bewildering succession of emperors and usurpers, most of them soldiers raised to the purple by their armies and then killed within months or years, sometimes by those same armies. In those 50 years, Rome had more than 50 rulers, an average reign of less than a year. Some of these barracks emperors were capable men trying desperately to stabilize an empire under siege from multiple directions. Others were simply opportunists in the right place at the right moment. Almost none died peacefully in bed. The external pressures were real and intensifying. On the Rhine and Danube frontiers, Germanic confederations, the Franks, the Alemanni, the Goths, had grown more powerful and more organized in the centuries since Augustus had tried to extend Roman power east of the Rhine. Where once Roman armies had faced individual tribes that could be defeated in detail, now they faced confederations of tribes that could field large disciplined forces and maintain pressure along hundreds of miles of frontier simultaneously. In the east, the old Parthian Empire had been replaced by the far more aggressive Sassanid Persian Empire, founded by the dynasty of Ardashir I in 224 CE. The Sassanids were heirs to the ancient Persian military tradition, their cavalry armored in scales of iron or leather, their cataphracts heavily armored horsemen, formidable against Roman infantry. In 260 CE, the Sassanid king Shapur I defeated and captured the Roman Emperor Valerian at the Battle of Edessa, the first and only time in Roman history that a reigning emperor was taken prisoner by a foreign enemy. The image of Valerian kneeling before Shapur was carved in massive relief into the rock cliffs of Persepolis, visible to every traveler who passed that way for centuries afterward. The economic consequences of the crisis were severe. War was expensive, soldiers demanded higher pay, emperors who wanted to keep their armies loyal, and every emperor understood that loyalty was the only thing keeping them alive, were forced to increase military payments continuously. To pay for these increases, the silver content of the Roman denarius was steadily reduced, debasing the currency. A coin that was, in the time of Augustus, approximately 95% pure silver contained. By the 260s, barely 5% silver, the rest was bronze alloy. Merchants and tax collectors, seeing what was happening, demanded more coins for the same goods, driving inflation in a slow, grinding spiral that hit the poorest hardest. Trade declined as the roads became less safe and the currency less reliable. Cities across the empire built new walls. The walls of Rome itself were rebuilt and strengthened in this period, for the first time since the Gallic sack of 390 BCE. The rebuilding of city walls is one of the quietest but most eloquent signs of imperial decline. Cities that felt secure did not build walls. The walls of the 3rd century say, in stone, that the empire no longer felt secure. There was plague too. The Antonine plague of the 2nd century had killed perhaps 5 million people across the empire. The plague of Cyprian in the 260s was, by contemporary accounts, even more devastating in some regions, killing thousands per day in Rome at its height, sweeping through cities and military camps, emptying farmsteads and disrupting the agricultural labor that fed the empire's cities. And yet, and this is important, the Roman Empire did not fall in the 3rd century. Broken as it was, battered as it was, the institutional structures held, the Senate persisted, the law persisted, the roads were maintained, if imperfectly. Cities shrank but did not die. The concept of Rome, the idea of Roman civilization as something worth defending, remained powerful enough to motivate generation after generation of soldiers and administrators. The man who finally ended the worst of the crisis was Diocletian, a Dalmatian soldier who rose from obscure origins to the throne in 284 CE and proved to be one of the most capable administrative minds Rome had ever produced. Diocletian understood that the empire had become too large and too complex for any single man to govern alone. His solution was radical. He divided imperial administration among 4 rulers, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars, in a system called the Tetrarchy. He also reformed the army, the tax system, and the bureaucracy. He fixed prices and wages by imperial edict, an attempt to control inflation that largely failed in practice, but demonstrates the scale of the economic problem. He raised the number of legions, bringing in more frontier troops, limitanae, to hold the borders, and creating a mobile reserve, comitatenses, that could respond rapidly to breaches. When Diocletian retired voluntarily in 305 CE, the only Roman emperor to retire rather than die in office, the empire was, for the moment, stabilized. The crisis had passed, but it had changed Rome permanently. Part 13: Constantine and Christianity. The world that emerged from the crisis of the 3rd century was not quite the same world that had entered it. The boundaries were still roughly the same. The legions still marched, the Senate still met, but something in the texture of Roman life had changed, something in the way Romans understood their place in the cosmos and the nature of the power that governed them. And into that changed world, in the early years of the 4th century, walked a man who would change it further still. Constantine was the son of Constantius I, one of Diocletian's tetrarchs, and a woman named Helena, who may or may not have been formally married to his father when Constantine was born. He was probably born around 272 CE, and he grew up in military camps and imperial courts, learning the trade of soldier and administrator from childhood. When Constantius died in 306 CE at Eboracum, modern York in northern England, his troops immediately acclaimed his son as emperor, setting off a decade and a half of civil war as competing claimants battled for control of an empire that Diocletian's tetrarchic system was proving unable to hold together. The decisive moment came in October of 312 CE, on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, fought just outside Rome between Constantine and his main rival Maxentius. What happened that night, or what Constantine later said happened, has been debated ever since. According to the Christian bishop Eusebius of Caesarea, who wrote a biography of Constantine in the years following the emperor's death, Constantine saw a cross of light in the sky above the sun, accompanied by the Greek words, "Conquer by this." In a dream that night, Christ appeared to him and instructed him to put the Christian symbol on the shields of his soldiers. The next day, Constantine's army defeated Maxentius, whose forces broke and fled across a bridge of boats on the Tiber that collapsed, drowning the pretender and thousands of his men. Constantine entered Rome as undisputed master of the Western Empire, and from that moment onward he was conspicuously favorable to Christianity. In 313 CE, he and his co-emperor, Licinius, issued the Edict of Milan, which extended full religious toleration to Christians throughout the empire, ending the systematic persecutions that had periodically targeted Christian communities since the time of Nero. More than toleration, Constantine actively supported the church, funding the construction of magnificent basilicas in Rome and elsewhere, endowing churches with land and property, giving bishops judicial powers, filling the imperial administration with Christian officials. In 324 CE, after defeating and executing Licinius, Constantine became sole ruler of the entire empire. He convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, bringing together bishops from across the empire to resolve doctrinal disputes, particularly the controversy over the nature of Christ, and thus asserting imperial authority over the internal organization of the church. His most visible legacy was a city, Constantinople. Constantine's city was founded in 330 CE on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, at the narrow strait of the Bosphorus, where Europe and Asia nearly touch, where the Black Sea drains into the Mediterranean world. The site was superb, a triangular peninsula naturally defended on two sides by water, the neck of the triangle, and the landward approach, narrow enough to be walled at modest cost, yet positioned at the crossroads of the major sea and land routes connecting the western and eastern halves of the empire. Constantine built his new capital with imperial extravagance, a forum bearing his name and featuring a tall porphyry column topped with a statue of himself as the sun god, a hippodrome adjacent to the imperial palace for chariot racing. Magnificent churches, of which the most important was the Hagia Sophia, built in its original form by Constantine's son and rebuilt in the legendary domed version we know today by Justinian in 537. An aqueduct, harbors, granaries, and walls. He populated it by offering free grain to anyone who moved there, echoing the old Roman grain dole but on a new city scale, and by bringing artworks and statues from cities throughout the empire to decorate its streets and squares. Within a generation, Constantinople was one of the largest cities in the world. Within 2 centuries, it would be the world's largest city. As for Constantine's Christian faith, was it genuine? The question has been asked for 1700 years and has never been definitively answered. He was not baptized until he was dying, which some take as evidence of political rather than spiritual motivation. Baptism forgave all past sins, and he had many. He continued to issue coins with traditional solar imagery years after his supposed conversion. He executed his own son Crispus and his wife Fausta in circumstances that remain deeply puzzling. He never forced pagans to convert during his lifetime, and his laws were not uniformly Christian in their content. What is certain is that his decision to throw imperial support behind Christianity transformed the religion. What had been a minority faith, persecuted in living memory, now had the resources and the legitimacy of the world's greatest empire behind it. Churches rose where temples had stood, bishops became figures of civic as well as religious authority. The theology of Christianity developed rapidly in this new environment, shaped by councils and controversies and the attentive interest of emperors who understood that a divided church was a political liability. The world was being remade, one prayer at a time. Part 14. The Fall of the Western Roman Empire. Empires do not usually end the way storms end, with a sudden cessation of noise and a return to silence. They end the way winter ends, gradually, imperceptibly, with long cold spells and brief warm ones. And then one day you realize the leaves are coming back and you cannot quite say when the turning happened. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was exactly like that. From the perspective of someone living through the 4th and 5th centuries CE, there was no single moment at which it was obvious that Rome was ending. There were crises. Yes, there had always been crises. There were invasions, usurpations, and economic difficulties, and religious controversies. But Rome had survived all of these before. It was the eternal city. It had been standing since 753 BCE. The structural weaknesses that made the fall inevitable had been accumulating for generations. The economy of the western provinces was less robust than that of the east. Fewer large cities, less trade, a more subsistence-based agriculture, less able to generate the surplus wealth that funded armies and administrations. The population of Italy had been declining slowly since the 1st century CE. The silver content of the currency had been so thoroughly debased that taxation and payment were increasingly conducted in kind rather than coin, creating additional inefficiencies in an already strained system. The military too had changed. Unable to recruit sufficient soldiers from the Roman citizenry, the emperors had been hiring Germanic federates, foederati, in increasing numbers, entire units of Frankish or Gothic warriors, serving under their own chiefs, their loyalty to Rome reliable only as long as their pay arrived. The process of what scholars sometimes call barbarization of the army was not a sudden decision, but a slow adaptation to demographic reality. And it meant that the army defending Rome was increasingly made up of people whose cultural connections to Rome were limited. The Huns changed everything. The Huns were a nomadic people from the eastern steppes. Their exact origins are disputed, but they appear in the historical record in the 370s CE moving westward across the plains north of the Black Sea with a speed and ferocity that shook every people in their path. Their cavalry tactics, riding, shooting, wheeling away, never allowing an enemy to pin them down, were unlike anything Europe had experienced. They were not interested in settling and administering a territory. They were interested in tribute, in plunder, in the exercise of power through terror. The Huns' westward movement had the effect of a billiard ball, striking others. It set in motion the great migration of the Gothic peoples. The Visigoths, pressed from behind by the Huns, and unable to stop them, appealed to the Roman Emperor Valens for permission to cross the Danube into Roman territory, not to raid or conquer, but to settle, to seek safety within Rome's frontier. Valens agreed. What followed was a catastrophe born of Roman administrative failure. The officials assigned to receive the Gothic refugees took bribes instead of organizing food and shelter, leaving hundreds of thousands of desperate people in conditions of near starvation. The Goths, understandably, revolted. In August 378 CE, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Gothic cavalry destroyed a Roman army and killed the Emperor Valens himself. It was the worst Roman military defeat since Cannae, 600 years earlier. Adrianople was not the end, but it was the beginning of the end. From that point on, the frontier that had separated the Roman world from the Germanic peoples ceased to be a real barrier. Groups of Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Burgundians and others settled within Roman territory, sometimes as allies, sometimes as conquerors, always as something other than fully integrated Romans. In 410 CE, the Visigoths under their king Alaric sacked Rome itself, the first time the city had been taken by an enemy since the Gauls of 390 BCE. The news spread shock across the empire and the Christian world. Augustine of Hippo in North Africa began writing his great work, The City of God, partly in response to pagan accusations that Christianity had weakened Rome's divine protection. The physical sack lasted only 3 days and was, by the standards of ancient warfare, relatively mild. No systematic massacre, no burning of the city, considerable restraint by Alaric's Christianized Goths. But the psychological impact was enormous. The Emperor Honorius, on hearing the news, was at his capital in Ravenna, in northeastern Italy. According to a later story, he was feeding his pet chicken, also named Roma, when a court official came to report that Rome had perished. "But it just ate from my hand," Honorius exclaimed in confusion. The story is probably invented, but it captures something real about the increasingly detached and ineffectual nature of the Western imperial court in its final decades. The following decades were a slow and painful narrowing of imperial control. Province after province came under the effective rule of Germanic warlords. Britain by around 410, Spain progressively from 418, North Africa from 429. Under the Vandal King Gaiseric, the tax base of the Western Empire shrank, the army shrank, the emperor in Ravenna, for Rome had long since ceased to be the effective capital, exercised shrinking authority over a shrinking territory. The last emperors of the West were, many of them, children or puppets, placed on the throne by powerful Germanic commanders who preferred to rule through a compliant figurehead rather than take the title for themselves. It was neater that way. Rome's symbolic weight still mattered. The last of these emperors was Romulus Augustulus, a name that combined, with painful irony, the name of Rome's legendary founder and the title of its first emperor. He was a teenager, elevated to the throne by his father Orestes, a Roman general of mixed Roman and barbarian blood. In 476 CE, the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, commanding a force of federates who had been refused the land grants they demanded, deposed Romulus Augustulus and sent him into comfortable exile at Castello dell'Ovo in Naples, where he apparently lived quite pleasantly for several decades afterward. Odoacer sent the Western imperial insignia to Constantinople, to the Eastern Emperor Zeno, declaring that there was no longer any need for a Western emperor. One emperor ruling from Constantinople was sufficient. The Eastern Emperor received the insignia without objection. And that was it. No great battle, no burning, no final heroic stand. A teenager was sent to the seaside. An emperor's regalia was packed in a box and shipped east. The Western Roman Empire, which had organized the lives of perhaps 30 million people for 5 centuries, simply ceased to exist. The lights did not go out all at once. They dimmed slowly over years and generations. Latin continued to be spoken. Roman law continued to shape the legal codes of the successor kingdoms. Churches continued to be built in the Roman style. Bishops maintained an administrative continuity in cities where no other institution survived. Roman roads were still walked if not maintained. But the thing itself, the empire, the legions, the emperor in the west, was gone. Part 15. Rome's legacy. But here is the thing about Rome. It never really ended. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, as later historians called it, though the Byzantines themselves always called it simply Romania, the Roman state, continued from Constantinople for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the West, its last emperor dying in 1453 CE, when Ottoman Turkish forces breached the Theodosian walls and entered the city. For those 1,000 years, the emperors of Constantinople maintained Roman law, Roman court ceremony, Roman bureaucratic structures, and the Roman title. The Eastern Roman Empire was not Rome's ghost. It was Rome in one of its many forms. But even in the West, where Roman political power was gone, the legacy was inescapable. Language first. Latin did not die with the empire. It survived as the language of the church, of law, of scholarship, of international correspondence for more than 1,000 years after Rome's fall. Thomas Aquinas wrote his theology in Latin in the 13th century. Newton published his Principia Mathematica in Latin in 1687. Medical and legal terminology throughout the world remains Latin to this day, and from Latin's living body, changing century by century as people's mouths shaped it differently in different places. As new words entered and old words shifted meaning, grew the Romance languages: Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Romanian, Catalan, and dozens of related dialects. Today, more than 800 million people speak a Romance language as their first language. Every time someone in Buenos Aires orders a coffee, every time a Parisian reads a novel, every time a Roman grandmother scolds her grandchild, they are speaking a direct descendant of the language of Cicero and Virgil and the soldiers who marched along the Via Appia 2000 years ago. Law, second. The Roman legal tradition is perhaps the most direct and continuous inheritance from antiquity to the modern world. Roman law was systematized by the great jurists of the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, and then codified most completely by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. The Corpus Juris Civilis, or body of civil law, which drew together centuries of legal opinion, imperial legislation, and juristic commentary into a coherent system. This corpus became the foundation of legal study in medieval European universities from the 12th century onward, and from there it shaped the legal systems of virtually every European country, and every country that inherited a European legal tradition. The concepts of Roman law are still living concepts, innocent until proven guilty. The presumption of good faith in contracts, the right to property, the idea of corporate legal personhood, the distinction between public and private law, the adversarial structure of a trial in which each side presents its case before an impartial judge. The American Senate takes its name from the Roman Senate. The American Republic was explicitly modeled by its founders on the Roman Republic. The three branches of American government, executive, legislative, judicial, mirror the Roman constitutional balance of consuls, senate, and courts. Architecture, third, the arch, the dome, concrete, vaulted ceilings, the basilica plan, a rectangular hall with colonnades and an apse, which Rome adopted from Greek and earlier forms and which became the template for the Christian Church, a form still in use in every country with a tradition of European Christianity. The great domed buildings of Western architecture, the Pantheon in Rome, still standing after nearly 2000 years, its unreinforced concrete dome, the largest in the world until the Renaissance, the domed churches of Byzantium, the Cathedral of Florence, the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, the Capitol in Washington, all trace their lineage through a continuous tradition of dome building back to the Roman engineers, who discovered that a hemispherical shell of concrete, if properly constructed, could cover a vast interior space without internal supports. Roman road building techniques influenced the construction of European roads well into the modern era. the concept of the planned city, laid out on a grid, centered on a forum with civic and commercial buildings, serviced by running water and sewage, was a Roman invention that became the standard template for urban settlement from Britain to Syria. Calendar. Fourth, the Julian calendar, reformed by Julius Caesar with the help of the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes in 46 BCE, gave the world a solar year of 365 days, with a leap year every 4 years. The Gregorian calendar, which is the calendar most of the world uses today, is a minor modification of the Julian calendar made in 1582 to correct a small accumulated drift. The months of our year, January and February, named for the god Janus, and the purification festival, February, March for the god Mars, April possibly from the Etruscan god Apru, May from the goddess Maia, June from the goddess Juno, July named for Julius Caesar, August for the Emperor Augustus, are all Roman names. We have been living inside Rome's calendar for 2000 years, and perhaps most intangibly but most powerfully, the idea of a common humanity. Rome was not an ethnically defined state, it was defined by law. The Roman jurist Gaius, writing in the 2nd century CE, laid out a principle that reverberated far beyond his time. All men are either free or slave, and among the free, all who are citizens stand equal before the law. The Constitutio Antoniniana of 212 CE, issued by the Emperor Caracalla, extended Roman citizenship to essentially all free inhabitants of the empire, not because they were Roman by blood or culture, but because they were human beings living within Roman jurisdiction. This was an extraordinary idea, and it did not die with Rome. It was absorbed into Christian theology, into Stoic philosophy, into the natural law tradition that runs from the Roman jurists through the medieval canonists to the Enlightenment philosophers, who wrote the rights of man into the founding documents of modern democratic states. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That is Rome speaking. Still, across 2000 years, we have come a long way tonight. We began on the banks of the Tiber with a basket in the current and a she-wolf in the shade of a fig tree on the Palatine Hill. A story that may not be true in its details, but is deeply true in its spirit, because it tells us something real about how Rome understood itself, as something nurtured by the land, shaped by danger, made strong by hardship, capable of extraordinary tenderness and extraordinary violence, and ultimately destined to endure. We watched a village become a city, and a city become a kingdom, and the kingdom become a republic, and the republic become an empire that held the Western world in its organized, law-giving, road-building embrace for 500 years. We followed the legions across the Alps and through the forests of Gaul. We sat in the shade of a Roman portico, in the heat of a Mediterranean afternoon, listening to the splash of a fountain and the distant shout of children playing in a courtyard. We watched Caesar pause at a river in the dark, the whole future balanced on the edge of a world. We stood in the vast cool shadow of the Colosseum, and on the deck of an Alexandrian grain ship crossing the Mediterranean, and in a frontier fort somewhere in the British Rhine, reading a letter from home. We watched the empire slow and struggle and finally, quietly, put down its burden in a small ceremony involving a teenage boy and a box of regalia sent east. And then we watched it not die, because the most important thing about Rome, the thing that makes it different from every other empire in history, is that it never truly ended. It transformed, it dissolved into 1,000 smaller forms, and was reconstituted in 100 different ways, and permeated every dimension of the civilization that followed it. And that civilization permeated the civilization that followed that one. And so on down to the morning you woke up today and made coffee, and drove on a road, and consulted a law, and spoke in a language that carries within its very bones the grammar and the vocabulary and the sound of Latin voices. You are Rome's descendant, and tonight, as your breathing slows and the weight of your body settles deeper into rest, let the images of this long journey drift through your mind with the unhurried pace of the Tiber in summer, the Palatine Hill golden in morning light, the forum full of voices, a legionary sharpening his gladius beside a campfire on the Rhine, a child in a Roman garden chasing a rolling hoop through sunlight and shadow, the dome of the Pantheon open to the sky, rain falling in a perfect circle on the marble floor below. The sun is setting over Rome. The shadows of the seven hills grow long across the Tiber plain. In the Forum, the last merchants pack their goods, and the last argument concludes in the long colonnades. The Vestal Virgins are finishing their rituals in the round temple by the Sacred Way. A centurion on the Capitoline watches the western sky go from gold to pink to the deep purple of evening. From Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara, the lamps of 1,000,000 Roman homes are beginning to glow. The eternal city is settling into its eternal evening, and you, somewhere at the edge of sleep, have traveled 1200 years of history tonight, and can rest now, knowing that the roads are straight, and the aqueducts are flowing, and the law is written down for everyone to read. Sleep well.